Oh, what am I gonna do?
Sell it on the dark web.
Yeah, is that okay? We're gonna sell it on the dark web.
I know.
Sorry, I didn't want to. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We're gonna share it. Not all the students are gonna be able to join for various reasons. So those who aren't, we're just gonna share it locally. And if you're comfortable with it, we have as you know, you're the first in the lecture series this summer, so we like to put these publicly on our website. But again, if you're uncomfortable with that, of course we won't do that. Just share it locally.
You're recording now, right? So we can't tease Perry.
Yeah, that's right.
No. So I don't know how much time we want to give because we only have an hour together. So should we kick it off?
That's totally.
Yeah.
It's okay. I'm going to do a very, very brief introduction by way of really celebrating, Mireille, your scholarship and the connection between your politics and the delivery of intellectual matter in our collective experience at Taubman College and beyond. I am incredibly grateful that you've accepted the invitation to share your thoughts with us. For those of you who don't know Mireille, please go find her, read her stuff. She's published extremely widely. In particular, you'll find amazing pieces in Places Journal, in Manu, in Volume, in Architectural Review. And you'll find books that she's produced with her own photography that are absolutely beautiful and really render explicit the relationship between history, context, criticality, and image. Mireille works with us in the architecture department, but she's also a contributor to research on women and gender at the Institute of Research on Women and Gender. And she looks very carefully at the politics of representation in contemporary culture. Hey, hi, Cynthia. Yeah, this is like a fan club. And I would say, you know, if I'm going to be just very, very brief and explicit, but Mireille is one of our colleagues that clearly treats our experience at Taubman College as an institution and not as an organization, and lives by the politics of her ethics, and those are played out in everything that she does. It's very hard, you know, if you're unfamiliar with the back end of academia, to understand the virtuosity of that, where we sometimes find ourselves in almost like a sack of crabs, you know, looking for resources, looking for opportunities. But Mireille stands by her ethics and her research and her design and her capacity to cast a critical eye on the world and to contribute to our collective intellectual ethos is extraordinary. And thank you, Mireille, for accepting again the invitation to talk to us, this first conversation. And I guess that's enough for me. But thank you.
Thank you. It's funny you'd say that. I just saw this movie by Dupontel that won all the French Academy Awards, and it's so critical of the society. And at the interview, he begins by saying, I am the cultural maker, I am the elite, I am the #1 idiot. And all the people interviewing him, and he's like, you too, but because I'm putting myself in the batch, it feels like it's okay to say this. So even though I'm going to be talking about institutions from a questioning eye, let me share. Have you enabled my screen share? Yeah. Okay, let me, a month away from Zoom and I can't figure out how to screen share. Check that out. Okay, so where's my Zoom screen again? Share screen, desktop 2, here we go. Is it working? Okay. So you asked me to talk about time and temporality. So I just thought I'd put this into the notions of cycles, even though this is a very mild version of what the longer version would look like that I have in mind, but I didn't want to lose everyone at the very beginning. So I'm going to have a very brief overview, but what I want to do mostly is for all of you to ask yourselves very specific questions, in particular, that questions of the ends of design. For whom do we work? We understand that design, if we understand design to be a tool, to be or medium, for whom do we work? I work for the University of Michigan, but I also work for all of you students. I also work to make a living and pay my rent. There's a lot of different aspects to this, but I'll start by positioning practice itself in terms of these two opposites that are sort of obvious, but when students start architecture school, and I'm not sure what the range is, I recognize names from both undergrad and grad. I don't know, does it begin with first year or juniors or seniors?
Broad mix.
Broad mix, this is great. It's never, I mean,
even planning is here, planning in the house.
it's never not a good time to keep questioning this division within the field between what we can refer to as the practice of architecture and the provision of the services of an architect versus the production of culture, and which we qualify as the discipline of architecture. And here you can question the role of institutions, educational institutions. So we can understand there are some schools that polytechnic schools by definition were made or land grant universities were defined to educate those who were going to service the land. It was a public education in order to serve the public, as opposed to some of what now we call institutions of discipline, which had very different end goals. So on the one hand, you can say it's manufacturing cultural producers. On the other hand, it might be manufacturing production teams, or it might be about maintaining and working with and helping the status quo as opposed to transforming the status quo. I am not putting a value judgment here. Again, I'll insist on this. Both are super useful, but I think it's interesting to think at which time periods do we favor one over the other? And because I'm thinking of cycles a lot, I mean, this is a little bit like election periods. You have like the year of campaigning and all of the volunteers that are at stake working on that, versus once you have a good campaign and everyone's happy with the result, it does take a good production team to make it happen. And all of it has different value at different time periods. But this division really came up for me strongly when John McMurray invited Peter Eisenman to speak at our college many years ago, 10 years ago. And the conversation really pissed off the students, which was interesting because he sort of came out and positioned Michigan as a sort of institution of practice, and definitely not as one of discipline. And so he said his own school and his own world, they were cultural producers, whereas the role of what he said, the role of state schools is to take care of the other half, to enter the institution of practice. And so the question that one can pose is really that, even though Michigan's a public school, even though we know how much budget cuts we've experienced, is the mission of a state university to foster discipline? Why is the state subsidizing us? And what is the role of state schools in the creation of and in the participation into discourse? But I would say, just to think again about this cycle, like election cycles, we can really also understand this division between working for the system as it exists and then working towards inventing, creating a better system, a more just, equitable, diverse, inclusive, conscious system, a system that's of its time. Inevitably, the value judgment comes also between this shift between economic power to cultural power. So there are power issues involved, but I'll get into that later. But one can say, just like in the election period, if you're full-time hire, you're going to make much more than if you're a dreamer who's just volunteering their time into changing the world. So I've defined 5 different sort of identifications for architecture, for the practice of architecture. that are roughly organized on that continuum, from the most money to the least money, from the most dystopic and to the most utopic, if you want, from that which works with the status quo uncritically to that which is the most critical. And I'm only putting these down so that in the end I can just revert the whole thing. But just I need to start off with an order in order to then disrupt it. So the first two I will really not talk about. The third one, it's more relevant to what you're focusing on, and I'll touch on a little bit, and then I'll just mostly talk about number 4 and touch on number 5 if I have time. But the first one, we understand what I mean by the business of architecture. It's when the business part comes before what it is that we're selling, when venture capitalists invest in a business much before they figure out what the service is. We know what that yields. It's not that interesting for us. The private service of architecture can be super interesting. It doesn't have a huge impact on the public realm. And so we can discuss it if we want. There's huge relevance there. And the domestic sphere is also incredibly relevant, but that's a whole other lecture, if not a whole other course. And so I want to begin with really the public service of architecture. What do we mean by that? And what I mean by that at this point, and I'm showing some contemporary social housing projects, what I mean by that is really the provision of public services. What are public services? What is the public? And what does it mean to serve the public? And I don't mean necessarily yet some architecture that is public. What I mean is architecture that comes from public money, architecture that comes from taxes. So for example, after World War II, there was a lot of destruction. And so a lot of social housing experiments and the role of architects became very important in reconstruction. So a lot of architects and urbanists were mobilized to understand what their role could be in serving society, since there was not so much physical infrastructural disruption. And so the 50s and 60s in Europe saw this huge development of social housing. Add to that the return of the colonies, add to that huge movement from the rural areas to the urban areas. And there was like a housing crisis that lasted for 50 years that's still going on. And so the role of the state is to accommodate bodies in a way to understand how to deal with housing crisis, how to make sure that everyone has a roof over their head. And so it is that money that has led to the construction of low-income housing, social housing, all of this. This is an example of the same building that the state puts money back into. And the role of the architect is knowing budgets are limited because they are based on our taxes. You don't want to be abusive just for the sake of having extra glam in your portfolio. You want to make sure that there's a certain efficiency to meet both the client and the user. And so in the case of private architecture, the client is the user. In the case of public architecture, you have this disruption. Where is your allegiance? Is it to the user or is it to the client? Now, in the States, it gets more complicated because public services have such disinvestment. And so it doesn't mean we haven't had times of better investment in public services, like the Pruitt-Igoe came under Truman's Fair Deal. Right now there's a new version. The Fair Deal came after the New Deal. Now there's a new Deal. There's always effort to mobilize public money and to look at big projects and big infrastructural projects of what to do, but there's also a lot of resistance to it. And sometimes it's the fault of economics, sometimes it's the fault of the architects, but in any case, we know that Pruitt-Igoe's destruction was sort of the end of an era, and there's very few architects who are mobilized today in the construction of public public units that serve to make sure that everyone has a roof over their head. So on the other hand, you can think of these institutions where this is what we get. This is exactly like the lack of architecture or the lack of urbanism that we see in examples such as FEMA. So if I start with the example of World War II, I mean, these days we have hurricanes coming through every few months that could generate a mobilization and the use of our specific expertise, at least as much as the urbanists and architects were used in the post-war era. But interestingly enough, while architects are all very willing to participate in the public good, it's the institutions that manage it tend to be nonprofits or tend to be private. And so looking into these is always interesting. I mean, if you think about Rural Studio, it's part of is it Tulane? Now I'm blanking out. The Alabama, I can't remember. It's part of education. Albert, thank you, Neil. Or if you look at the Make It Right Foundation that spent a lot of money for the prototypes in New Orleans. Every time I look into what the developments have been, there's always a lawsuit or another. Maybe because Brad Pitt is behind it. Maybe because no one takes seriously a showcasing of architecture that looks like much more than it needs to be. Who knows? But in any case, it's the role of this middle ground, the role of these nonprofit is always an interesting one to me. How do we trust nonprofits? How do we trust the intents behind these institutions that both need money to survive, but also serve particular. So I could say this is also what are the ends of institutions in a way? How do we question that? But I think one thing is sure, and here I'm generalizing to the picture of the big state as much as I do to the role of a much smaller client, public client. It's that we really have these two versions. We have the engagement of the discipline and the autonomy of the discipline. So when is it that the schools teach you to engage the world and have real clients and have real projects? And when is it that school kind of closes in or architects choose to disconnect from the real world and function into what we understand to be the autonomy of the discipline, this notion of the closed discourse. So if one can say, well, let's think about who's the client. So in the case of the public architecture, if the state represents the interest of all, to engage, to serve, to use our skill set to serve the state is not a bad idea whatsoever. Now, if the state represents some evil hegemonic power that creates inequality and extreme privilege, it might become more complicated than that, and there might be an engagement that's more complicit. Now, if that's the case, autonomy might actually be a form of ethical resistance, and it might be the most critical thing to do is to actually remove oneself from contributing. It's Reinhold Martin has a good article where he says the architect needs to learn from Melville's Bartleby and just say no, I would prefer not to, but then has to find other ways to pay the rent. But what is sure is that there's always a sense that if on the one hand we have sort of academia or theory and practice on the other hand, and there's always this notion that the more we go toward practice, the more there's some sort of compromise going on. Like the act of passing into practice sort of denotes a position of compromise. At the same time, it's also where there's more power that's yielded. So if on the top we have more cultural power, at the bottom I'm putting institutional control or financial political power. And so this sort of compromise of the discipline can also be really the notion of being, for me, the notion of resistance and complicitness is also linked to World War II. And there was a show at the Pompidou on Le Corbusier a couple years ago, and it was amazing how during the show there were all these protests, and then 3 different books, not 1, not 2, 3 different books came out that year, all of which denounced his role as a collaborator during World War II, because he agreed to work for the Vichy government. something that Jean-Louis Cohen talks about a lot in the Architecture and Uniform exhibit, which was turned into a book. And I loved that image. When you walked into the exhibit, there was that image of all of the architects involved, and it said all of them participated in the war, some as collaborators, some in the resistance, but it doesn't say who was whom until you actually visit the whole exhibit. But you start to see everyone from a completely different angle. And so between the sort of two extremes of the avant-gardes on one hand and the sort of old guard or cultural power on the other, and I want to sort of infiltrate in there the role of institutions, especially universities or art institutions. So here we sort of have the critical angle. Here we have the institutional control. I like to label these. It's always kind of fun to give them images of the guerrillas versus the vanguards versus the old guard. And so what I mean by these, if we can consider these would be sort of a form of institutional resistance. Here we would have, you know, sort of all the cultural, all the do-it-yourself movements, all the small structures. Imagine this is like the scale of, this is all the youth. This is all the ones that have no overhead. This is all the ones that don't have mortgages. It tends to be students. It tends to be young people. This is the face of the revolutionaries of May 68. It's also those who are dreamers. It's those who believe in changing the world because they still can. And at the top, these are the institutions that want to support that because they believe in it. There's a sort of optimism to that. In opposition to this, I'm positioning sort of those who are complicit with power. So maybe all of those who like the world the way it is now and can't deal too much with the rebellious youth who are never satisfied. But where it gets interesting is that these also belong to the same realm. So it's also, what is the role of these big, large institutions that are too big to fail, that have so much power that they whatever they tend to curate becomes the next thing. And that's important to really understand that it's a complicated territory, that such institutions are really tricky to navigate because it's never black or white. It's never a question of it's never good or bad. It's never, it's just complicated to serve because they're caught between two ends. One being the money that feeds them, the other being some intent that brings them meaningfulness. And here I'm putting these arrows because even within our lifespans, there's always this idea that we're going in order, that the youth is here and by the time you're old, you're over here. And this is, you know, what's happened to, there's very few characters who have remained young despite their age in their behaviors. I would say Vanagum is there, someone like Eisenman is not there. He's become the old guard. He's become the resistant to any sort of change. And then the paradigm shifts are when there's just a very natural process of revolutionary transition. So I want to go back to simply that spectrum to now speak a little bit about these institutions and the curation and the power of institutions to transform and create new patterns. So an institution, for example, like MoMA, which is a huge one, has produced exhibits such as the Uneven Growth exhibit, Tactical Urbanism for Expanding Megacities, and I'm going to talk about this explicitly. How is it that work that looks like this can end up at MoMA? On the other end, this is the same institution that has on its board someone like Danis Joannou. I don't know how you say his last name. I don't speak Greek. He's Cypriot. He's one of the richest art dealers in the world today. He has the Dusty Foundation for Contemporary Art, and he's on the council member for MoMA, as well as for the Met, as well as for the Tate, as well as for the Tate Modern Board of Trustees at the New Museum, and ex-president of the Guggenheim Foundation. Someone like this produces culture as well. So if you think, oh, whatever work ends up as MoMA ends up there because it deserves it, you can look at it from the opposite end. Joannou picks an artist, invests in that artist, holds on to the collection, gives that collection to the museums, waits until the cultural value is up, and then he has made a fortune because he has produced that value. Institutions work that way. Like that's the Wall Street aspect of institutions. They also work that way. So it becomes really, what I want to say is, do not, in the same way that as any good teacher, I'd say, do not trust anything I say. Wait until you experience and you critically assess what you see. The same is true of big institutions that we all dream of getting into. There, you also have to look at the mechanism through which value is produced, and to understand, okay, at which point has there been a switch? At which point did the value that made it interesting, didn't make the work relevant socially to our historical moment? At which point is that no longer the case, and now it's financial matter, it's cultural matter, it's networking matter, and it's a whole other game. But which is fine too. It's just that at that point it had sold the original value that led to the work emerging out of the masses. And so I want to speak as an example specifically about this category of architecture that I call unsolicited architecture. It has so many names. You can call it interventionist practices, you can call it urban play, tactical opportunism, action, spontaneous interventions. Some of these are the names of the exhibits that have curated them. But it's interesting that in the 20th century, and especially around 2008, that movement just exploded. And whereas it had always existed, the role of institutions has made it grow and really take over. And I also want to just kind of refer to the documents of contemporary art that tend to always take the temperature of a specific moment in time by doing these curated volumes. And so it's interesting to see that themes such as participation, the everyday, situation, ethics, all were themes that came out, between 2006 and 2015. There are themes that rose up that had nothing to do with the sort of themes that came out of the 90s, for example. But it doesn't mean that this stuff never existed before. There was definitely a return of a cycle to interest that came out of the 60s. And so, for example, if you think about the sort of participatory art or even relational aesthetics, that's something that you look at Alison Knowles, and that was having making dinner for the crowd at the museum in the 60s, redid it in 2012, but very similar to some of the work that emerged in museums in 2010. So the sort of cult of the object, and now the social fabric as the real material became key. There's a great literature of relational aesthetic, a great dialogue that really dissects and fine-tunes this that I like, that begins more or less with Bourdieu's book on relational aesthetics from 1998. And then back and forth between Claire Bishop's first reaction to it, and then you have Liam Gillig, Rancière, Bourdieu again, and Bishop's edited volume from some 10 years ago. All of these, if you're interested, I put them on opposite side because even though they're all of the same camp, it's kind of like the battles within the left. From the wall, you're like, oh my God, you're dissecting and splitting hair. But from up close, the battles are real serious. And there's arguments that are made in order to fine tune what is it that's happening and how is it that, what are the politics behind this work. But all of these practices, whether they're art practices or architectural practices, or have been described as socially engaged, community-based, dialogic, literal, participatory, interventionist, research-based, and collaborative. So between all of these, you can describe, it describes the range quite a bit. I would go to the first official curation into a museum of this kind of work with the Masmoka show called The Interventionist from 2004. I think that was the first official show in the US. These are the sort of collectives who were curated into that show. It was fascinating because none of these people at that point had done that work to end up in a museum. The work, that was not what the work was about. That was not the kind of work that ended up in museums to start with. So that was absolutely not the reason why one would do it. These were artists who were working directly into real life, not into the privileged realm of represented life. And so there was an interesting quote in the preface where the director of Masmoka said, interventionist art does not always sit well in museums, produced as much as it was to create situations in the world at large. And so you had example of work such as Budishko's Homeless Vehicle. You had examples of work such as Rakowitz's Parasite, where Michael Rakowitz made these inflatables to capture hot air in order to buffer the homeless population. You've all seen these projects, so it's interesting that the director said these don't sit well within museums. They weren't made to be in museums or in catalogs or scanned or in lecture courses. But since then, we've seen them mostly in museums. The Beyond Green exhibit toured endlessly, and This Will Have Been Art is another exhibit that toured. They even came to Michigan, to Northern Michigan University. But these have since then been exhibited again and again, to the point where it's difficult to imagine them actually in the street. I mean, I think that the homeless vehicle would be stolen by now if it was in the street, because its value has taken on so much as a prototype. But one can begin to think, okay, now who is this architecture for? Does it serve as a prototype, as imagination for all of us to see and conceive of an expanded range of what architecture can do? Or are they still intended for their original client? And I would argue right now, this has very little to do with the specific homeless person who could use it, and has much more to do with expanding an imagination, but they're not the same thing. In any case, the sort of boom of unsolicited architecture arrived also at the time when architects' work started to decline. And this became stronger and stronger until the 2008 crash. But in 2007, the whole issue of Volume magazine was on unsolicited architecture. Now, this is a journal that's a coalition between Columbia University, AMO, and Arcis, the Dutch institution. And the whole issue was giving examples of interventionist practices. They called it unsolicited architecture, and they had this sort of formula of how to define it. So if you look, I don't know if you can read the page on the right, but it gives the exact definition of what is how to make it. So first, you have to begin with an urgency and or an opportunity. That right there, there's a difference between who are we serving. Is the situation serving me as an architect because there's an opportunity for me to find work? Or is there an urgency and I can help, therefore I'm serving the person in needs of work, or the collective or the site in needs of work? I mean, the basic question here is like, what can architects do for the city, or what can the city do for architects? There's a little bit of both. And in box number 2, it says the absence of a traditional client-side budget and or program necessitate the transgression of status quo assumptions about these 4 cornerstones of architecture. If your project does not demand a rethinking of the 4 cornerstones of architecture, if it fails the unsolicited test, you are doing regular practice. And then it keeps on doing. Now, the fascinating aspect of this issue of volume is that in the very last page, it solicited unsolicited projects. And the irony seemed to be lost that canceled it and made it regular practice because we were just answering calls. But in any case, they had a very serious call for unsolicited architecture. And in the issue that followed, they published a lot more projects. So the collection started to grow, and the curation of such projects were so popular that there was a big impulse to curate more. And you started to see a lot of curating job that happened. Also in the Netherlands, you had Droog Event #2, that was urban play, another one that curated and showcased a lot of different examples of work, bottom-up work from all over the country. Again, the Rebar Project made it. And there were others, but eventually it went from, and when I say curate, it's as much in a journal or an exhibit or a catalog, which is usually halfway between the exhibit and the journal. But eventually the big crowning moment was when a lot of that work made it to the Venice Biennale. The one that was curated by Teddy Cruz and featured a lot of projects, including the Detroit Collaborative Design Center that had done these projects back early in the 21st century. But after, I think the one right before that was just like Neil Denari and the usual formalist projects that were beautiful models, super pristine production, and then all of a sudden the US Pavilion was filled with stuff that no one could make sense of, that seems so gritty. They had pictures of the Heidelberg project. People were wondering what was going on. In the chronology, I would then put the CCA in Montreal, Canada. The CCA had a big show that was called What Can You Do with the City? And they had 99 actions. They called it Actions. It was the name of the exhibit. They had these 99 actions. Again, the Rebar Project made it. That one became kind of a fixture of all of the curated efforts. But they covered the world. That was the most interesting aspect of it, was just the global spectrum. You understood. And again, in the preface, they called it relational aesthetics, art practices that have been described as all of these. But in the preface to the catalog, Zardini wrote, the exhibit gathers up but a minimum of the new actions, the singular practices aforementioned, found with increasing frequency in today's urban environment. They reveal the existence of a world rich in inventiveness and imagination. Alien to our contemporary modes of consumption, these actions propose alternative lifestyles, reinvent our daily lives, and reoccupy urban spaces with new uses. And again, they had a call to actions. Show us what you can do with the city. So it was interesting to see everyone try to make it into the exhibit. This was Christmas 2008. The first week of 2009, Anka and I had 2 studios of Wallenberg participate and do group work and produce. Part of it was you had to do the thing. It wasn't a speculative representation of an idea. It had to be built. It had to have proof that it engaged the world, and it was the social action, the social reaction, that was the material to be described. And some of these projects, the projects definitely enjoyed great participation in the city, which was the main event. But one can also say they also saw media exposition from the Michigan Daily, where the sliding to an A, some of the students built a hail for a sled in front of the library, to one of the projects that was published in Volume magazine, the free speech karaoke stand that was installed in front of the bus stop at the Duderstadt. So at a certain point, like this repetitive curation and emphasis on the value of these projects, because if there's no recognition, it's the recognition, what I'm trying to point to it, it's the recognition that produces the value. And so when there's a lot of top-down recognition, one can begin to wonder, what's the motivation? How is it that all of the work that functions, that puts the risk down on the individuals and functions as volunteer work, how is it that it's actually alleviating any responsibility from above? That's a question. As a Pranasi, that's a question. But in any case, the next Biennale functioned in the same way, and the 2012 spontaneous interventions, another one that was the outcome of a huge call. It had, I don't know how many hundreds of entries. They were classified according to all this color code, whether they were the economics or the scale or the budget or all of it. And this is another sort of series of adjectives to describe the practices: informal, guerrilla, insurgent, DIY, hands-on, etc., all tactical. I like open source. These are just a few of the words floating around to describe a type of interventionist urbanism sweeping through cities around the world. How do we make sense of this phenomenon? Like, why is it that all of a sudden everyone's willing to volunteer their skills? Or is it that anyone can be an architect, in which case, what is the nature of our own expertise? But I think as a phenomenon, it's been worth paying attention to, and sort of trying to tease out all the strings that link it to what's in it for whom. And again, they had a website where you could get ideas. The idea was also to make it open source, so that whatever was going on in Buenos Aires, you could use it and have it in the streets of Milano. And each project has a complete sort of description and a budget, and what the problem is, what the solution is. I like the stating of problem and solution. It seems very funny to define it as such. You see Gina and Mitch's powerhouse here. I mean, a lot of us participated in this. Imaging Detroit was Anya and Jean-Louis and myself. This project was probably the smallest scale, smallest budget. Is just stickers that are on the walls of the city that invite participation. And then I'll go really quickly through just the sort of culmination of more books, more catalogs, more issues of A+D between strategies and tactics, reclaim, and actions. And if you look through the sort of table of content of these, there's always the same sort of projects that repeat, but it's interesting to see which ones make it. And I would say one of the best theorization of this movement came with Mimi Zeiger's article. It's a 3-part article called The Interventionist Toolkit, which she wrote over a whole year. So there was a new part that came out every 2 months, or 4-part series even. And so in it, there's a lot of, she says it's kind of early to judge it, but how do we judge it? Because it's definitely not for aesthetics. How do we judge this work? Do we judge on the basis of intent or content, audience or producer, reach or outreach? And I'm kind of closing in soon for a Q&A, but I want to finish with the fact that she said it's not strategic. Like what the storefront for art and architecture had an exhibit too, and they called it strategies for public occupation. So here she says it's purely tactical, in the same way the storefront has been a tactical building itself. All of these projects are purely tactical. But I want to finish this part on the fact that they all pulled back to these 60s ideas of happenings and participation and participatory, the social matter, etc. But the politics of that time have been sort of pushed aside. The criticality of the rejection of the system has been put aside. And similar to the old school French rappers that were complaining that they had created their own production house in the 90s and had wanted to operate outside of the big circuits of musical production. And they were complaining, I heard them in interviews complain that they said the kids today that come out of the suburbs, they just rap because they put all their stuff on YouTube because they can't wait to be signed by like Sony. So it's the opposite. They were the voice of the ghetto, but today it's like that inversion. It was Public Enemy that said rap was the voice of the ghetto. Today it's the opposite. That voice wants to be reinserted and they can't wait to be institutionalized. So at which point is the institutionalization of that work against the work itself? So a lot of them will claim these influences from the situationist movement. And here they say, some of the main ideas we utilize in our thinking are situationist notions of détournement, de dérive, etc. In the context of situationalist thought, these ideas bear many often political and artistic implications. Since our agenda is not political, but more architectural, we do not address these aspects. So I think here that is an appropriation, that is a détournement right there. The work itself, like the last level of vanguard, where the work resisted top-down structures is now completely written up as a tactic, or rather now as a strategy for top-down structures to no longer have to take care of that aspect. I mean, again, back to the taxes. Why spend money if everyone's willing to produce it bottom up? And so the very final exhibit was the one at MoMA, which that's the last one I want to mention. There's been others since, but the sort of MoMA's culmination is an interesting moment. And it's the same, the MoMA in the US, and I would say the Venice Biennale is something as well. There was on one of the Biennale pavilions, on the Romanian pavilion some years ago, there was this graffiti that sort of had these lists. It was very ironic, but it had on one side of the building, it said 80% of reasons not to be at the Venice Biennale and 20% or 80% of reasons to be at the Biennale and 20% reasons not to be at the Biennale. Another one where they accepted the invitation and they have the criticism within the sort of participation, that paradoxical moment where they can't say no, but they still feel like they have to criticize it from the inside. So the 80% reasons to be at the Venice Biennale are very, very cynical in any way, such as to hit all the cool parties, good excuse for massive outfit shopping, etc. Whereas the reasons not to participate include the invisibility, that invisibility is resistance, not to decorate the gardens of the white male because it's guilt, etc. Venice Biennale is a shocking on money mercantilist fossil, and we have nothing to wear for the opening, so they do remain in that cynical mode. But I think the question of dissecting through that there are reasons to participate and there are moments to not participate in order for the strength of something not to be diluted is also there. Of the situationist, none of them ever give lectures in institutions. There was a rejection of that. But that is not to say that this era has not produced architectural practices. And so if that work started off as sort of bottom up small stuff, the result of it is that it's really started a lot of practices. So practices such as Exist, for example, were very young when they participated in the Meta Villa in the 2006 pavilion. They were just out of school and they had produced a living environment as their thesis project from school and had lived, it was a commentary on the housing crisis. So they had lived on this billboard. And 2 years later, they were commissioned with the whole French pavilion. So they turned it into a living environment. They moved in for the whole time of the Biennale. They just lived there. That was the exhibit, which was funny that the active dwelling had been so taken out of the discourse of architecture that it shocked everyone that to watch people live a domestic life could be part of an architectural Biennale. From that point on, they did a lot of interesting projects before they sort of dissolved. And not the some of the guys who were part of that team, or these two guys, actually all four of them, but these two guys, Julien and Nicolas, they started their own office. Again, very young, because they had so much success directly out of school, and they came to do a Biennale, Wallenberg lecture here. And it was cute because they started off by asking the students, so like, how do you get work after you're done with school? We just finished. This is how we do it, but how do you guys do it here? And what they said was, well, we make renderings for big offices. So that brings us cash because we know how to make computer renderings. And with the money that we have, we do spontaneous interventions. We invest them into making these what they call preposition. Everything in yellow were preposition projects that they would build out of their own money. That strategy got them, in very few years, got them all the budget they wanted to have, the commissions they wanted, but they maintained the cultural, the sort of proactive decision of what to do. So now they're just moguls of the French Cultural Ministry, with exhibits at the big architecture pavilion in Paris. They did the pavilion for the United Nations Climate Change Conference, and they were the curators of the last French pavilion. I believe, so this is one of the practices where, as you see them going to like gain cultural power, I'm watching them attentively because I'm waiting for them to kind of lose track of what they did, their attitude from early on. And they keep impressing me more and more because I feel the stakes are harder and harder. But they keep using the power they have and the budget they have. They just produced a movie sort of denouncing public-private partnerships and the effect of that. They did a whole documentary on the subprime crisis. It's interesting, and they bring it to architecture schools for free. So it's interesting how they're using and leveraging whatever cultural power they have to feed it back into sort of making sure they're energizing the youth to never settle for anything but what they believe in. And another firm I want to mention, because they were also part of the Wallenberg lectures, and also curated, also have huge cultural power. It's Liza Fuhr and Catherine Clark of MUF in the UK. They've earned all the biggest award that the UK can have, but they really made a manual out of it. Like, how do we work? This is what we do. And again, going back and forth between tactic and strategy, they begin with the detail, the close interrogation of the up close and personal, zoom out to the strategy, and then zoom back into the details. So they were purely with the social fabric is their material. And you see this is one of the project they did in Dalston around the time of the Olympics and the transformation of the neighborhood. But you see how they're always looking for the very specific, it's one of the most deprived ward in London, and 20% of the population is living on social benefits. But so they're trying to extract what value is there, constantly looking for local knowledge, looking for meeting with the people. And Liza Fuhr says, if you want to be an architect, 96% of my job is community meeting. If you do not like community meetings, you can't do this. Like, you have to be a social person, you have to be a patient person, you have to know how to deal with total radical inefficiency, because that is what we do. But that is the only way to enroll participation. And then they were working with the kids, having the kids take photographs, and this was the picture from their transformation of the British Pavilion. And I want to just finish with paper architecture and simply address it, because to me, unsolicited architecture and paper architecture are very similar. First of all, paper architecture is unsolicited architecture. It just exists in the public imagination rather than in the public realm, in the physical realm. It has the exact same process. I can do the same arc of how it exists and how it gets produced and reproduced depending on the media. So rather than maybe the museums, I would tackle the publication industry, starting with websites, starting with small websites, starting with starting with Instagram, starting with the way that information and images circulate. At which point is the work circulating because of the work, or at which point is the work circulating because of the mechanisms of circulation? But we've seen paper architecture range from the full range, from those who couldn't do anything but that because they were in jail, such as these two, to those who just didn't have the budgets to do real architecture, to those whose architecture could only exist on paper because the whole point was the narrative, not its physical manifestation on one site, but the general idea of the narrative. To those that were denouncing existing political moments, or moments to come, or utopic in their dystopicness, because they still believe that the circulation of an image that told an allegory could be beneficial to the public. So in that sense, the public is more the general public that benefits from the circulation of information and of images. There's also those who just did paper architecture because they didn't have clients and couldn't wait for clients to arrive, and so only produced the paper architecture in order for the clients to come. But I'll finish back with the Situationist project, and this is Constant's New Babylon. And it's interesting to remember that Constant was kicked out of the Situationist International because he published the images of New Babylon. That was not acceptable. That was the moment that wasn't acceptable. So this is my last slide with a quote from Reinhold Martin when he says, utopian realism is critical. It is real. It's utopian not because it dreams impossible dreams, but because it recognizes reality itself as precisely all too real dream, enforced by those who prefer to accept a destructive and oppressive status quo. Utopia's ghost floats within this dream, conjured time and again by those who would prefer not to. And that's it. Any questions?
Thank you. Mireille, do you want to stop sharing screen for a moment? I know
I'm
we
trying to figure out how to do that. I'm trying to find my Zoom page again. How to, maybe it's another. Here we go.
You want to draw? Just a word of thanks. I would really count on you to debunk the entire premise of this experimental summer experience at the very onset of our semester. And I say that as really graciously, but you're underscoring in many ways the impossibility of integrating service sector activities into an institutional space under the premise that it could in any way produce nuanced social good without rendering explicit the power dynamics that enable us to work in this space in the first place. And I think that's fantastic, and I'm really grateful. I know we're at the top of the hour, but would you mind staying for just a bit if anyone has any questions? Is that okay? Okay.
I'm not debunking, I'm just asking everyone to think consciously about what they're doing. But that's valid of any class, even structures with Peter.
Okay. So yeah, we have a couple of minutes with Mireille if anyone has any questions. It's a lot to take in.
I have a question. I don't know if it's a question. Thank you so much. I think it's such an amazing way to start off this course, like Anya said, because it's sort of, I really appreciate in particular Well, I like your diagrams a lot generally, but the vanguardistas, old guard and guerrillas diagram, I think is like really helpful. Even if they're, and you said this too, but even if they're like incomplete categories, I think it helps to sort of contextualize different kinds of practices. I think what I've always taken issue with people who call themselves guerrillas is that I don't think they're ever exempt from complicitness with institutions of power. For instance, Peter Eisenman, Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, occupied a position that said the best way to operate politically is to separate ourselves and become an autonomous discipline that is free, that is like largely focused on formalism and paper architecture, et cetera. Meanwhile, Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies was grant sponsored, and through like the word urban was used in the Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies because the premise of that externally was that they would be working on urban issues in New York, when in fact they weren't. Surprised. So I guess the question really is like, how do you think about these utopian practices? Because we don't, the fact that we even know about them means that they have been filtered through like a system that is implicated in all kinds of problems. I've always taken issue with people who have distinguished themselves as somehow outside of the bounds of like complicitness in power structures.
I think you're right. The real guerrillas, we haven't heard about them, and the one like those students who built the scaffolding and lived in it for the duration of their thesis as an active commentary on the shortage of student housing. If their teacher hadn't sent them to occupy the Biennale pavilion, they probably would have done other things, but we may never have heard of them. But it doesn't mean the project wasn't a really great radical one. Now the question is, what do you do with it? It's funny that you just said that about I think of Gordon Matter Clark throwing the rock through the window of the Urban Institute, and I think I've been thinking a lot of Matter Clark of Basquiat lately because of all the exhibit that have been going on their work. Or I mean, I just saw a line of Doc Martens with Basquiat print on it.
Yeah, so Keith Haring.
Like how much after they died, like their work and their image has been so milked by institutions.
Co-opted,
especially their work that was. I mean, Matter Clark was the end architect,
Mm-hmm.
Just like Duchamp was the end artist. Like, I don't know. Like, I'm with you. By the moment we've heard some of the lesson is this: some of the best work that exists is not leaving its village. But what good is it to the public if we haven't heard of it?
Yeah, that's the paradox.
It's all about filtering it.
I have so many questions, but I'm going to open. I'm sorry. This is like so. I hope students do, because this is like the bread and butter of what you're doing, and thinking about the very like UM Public Design Core is very much implicated in what Mireille is talking about, and I would say like is squarely fits within the vanguardistas, this sort of institutionalized, hopefully progressive mode of operation. But anyway, I'll stop. Thank you again. It's great. Really appreciate it.
This is amazing. Can I ask a quickish question? So I made a bunch of notes. Thank you, Mireille. This is shattering my earth, let's say, my world. I made a note about what I call the ethics of temporality. And I wondered, as what I talk about as relational assemblies, or relational contours, as those change over and through time, certain allegiances that we think we're participating with as architects obviously change and they redistribute themselves. And I guess over time, and with respect to value structures and points of view and so on, if architecture is always, let's say, relatively stable, it occurs to me that instable or unstable architecture would be something that, I don't mean as smart architecture or AI, or I don't know what I mean exactly yet, but it seems like architecture needs to be considerably more adept to change its affiliations and understand over timeframes in which territories it contributes, participates, realigns. I don't know if it's a question or not. I'm just thinking about an architecture which is a kind of a fast change artist, one that is really quite capable of negotiating on momentary notices or deep time, to use my good friend Professor Adams' phrase. Yeah, it's not an observation or a question exactly. I'm just trying to think about.
I've thought a lot about this.
Yeah. Yeah,
that's when I started saying I have a whole other lecture, but it'd be too much like for an introduction, because I've been thinking a lot about the natural cycles of evolution, which are absolutely not linear. They're just like
sure.
They work with paradigm shifts, and then they decline, and then you have revolutionary. But the revolutionary moments can be big revolutions, or they can be little revolutions. You have these rogue waves of revolutionary moments. But I like to think through that evolution in terms of this biological. You'd like this, the sort of biological models of evolution. So you have two models on species, that all the species fall under two models. There are selection and K-selection. So our selection are very small structures that reproduce massively, like mosquitoes or like tons of eggs.
Coral reefs, whatever, yeah.
Exactly, you just bet on a few, and they're super resilient structures. And then you have the big structures like the whale that just one offspring functions in big families, puts all the care into a single lineage, but can become extinct overnight. Whereas the small structures are so much more resilient and less extinct. And so in a way you see like the big case structures, which I have, my heart is kind of fond of, but in a way it's like Soviet Union, when it breaks, like it falls into pieces, as opposed to like a capitalist model that's constantly reinventing itself super fast. So in one way, the evolution is much closer of a straight line, and the other, it's like has these much longer steps. And so architecture is interesting that way, because architecture has the solidity and the fixity of these case structures of evolution, as opposed to like pop-ups. But you see that the emergence of pop-up structures, at least programmatically, in cities everywhere. Like the pop-up structure, like the restaurant downstairs is a different restaurant every night, because it's like Chinese restaurant one night and Italian the next night these days. And same with all the stores or pop-up structures these days. Those are the small resilient structures. And right now, just to finish, we have to be observant of what the situation is at any given economic model. Right now, we're in a situation of depression. We're like really bored. We can't afford investment right now. We can't afford big structures right now. So now is a moment of resilience. So in order to minimize damage, this is not the time to go for big investment. This is the moment to float off like a mosquito, to float on the surface. This is not the time for big foundations. So it would, whatever is the most ethical to me is what is adapted to the economic moment in which we're living, and to not pretend that it's always the same thing. I mean, I would say that with any ideology. Look, Marx wrote Capital during a total moment of economic crisis, and Adams wrote his text in a moment of boom. Of course, they were both right at that time. It's not like one is right and one is wrong. They were both right for the time period in which they were written. We go through it, economics. Look at Arrighi's Long Century. I mean, it's like every 120 years we've completed a new economic cycle of growth and stagnation and collapse and back up.
To follow up just really quick on that, Mireille.
I thought you were going to shut me down immediately.
Just one more, and then maybe, or however much you have an appetite for. But if we talk about resilience and we talk about aging and maturation of the interventionist project and the ones that survived, it's mostly European projects that you're bringing up as having, been tested by time and matured to a level of longevity that's remarkable, right? So the very capital flux and the political system that nourishes public projects is intrinsically linked to the capacity of an interventionist project to become a vanguardista or to connect to more stable cultural and social infrastructure. What do you do living in a situation where we are in an accelerated capitalist adaptive form? You brought up interborough, but they really are embedded in a socialist system, i.e. academia, and everyone else is somewhere other than the projects that you brought up as the mature projects of our age. What should we do about that? Vote.
No, it's a huge question, and I would say same as whatever the counselor tells you about whatever money you invest in Wall Street. Diversify. This is not the time to put all your chips in the same basket for sure, but I would say there's a huge movement here. It's part of the degrowth movement, but the degrowth movement is a movement of narrowing down the ties to reach something much closer to autonomy, which is something that can be said of any architectural practice, which is something that can be said of any institution too. Like it's crazy right now to think that the way to save an institution is growth. Like I think in the US the cult of growth is not even shaken. Like it's the only voice. So there's not even an alternative to it. It's just all, but growth at this point in the economy is the risks are too high, but the higher the risk, the more you grow. The higher the risk, the more you grow. I mean, you've read Jared Diamond and Collapse. That's the risk, I would say. I mean, I'm not really answering your question, but I would say what do we do is reduce down the circle of operation as much as possible. But that includes the circle of information. That includes that's circulation of capital, but also circulation of information too. But that goes against like the tendency towards communication teams and large, like it's a catch-22 because again it's just living on credit, but the more exposure we get, the more we can rake in, but the more the system grows. I don't know, it's a tough one. It's really a tough one. I wouldn't want to be at the head of a big institution right now. I'd feel like I'd be too scared. But it's interesting that, that we turn to these small structures, like all of these little interventionist projects are such a return to like the tiny structures. How do you answer your question? Because I know you have something in mind.
No. I'm grappling with this on a daily basis. I have no answer to your question. I do think that diversification is straight up. I think rendering explicit the flux of capital in everything that you do has to be a baseline in accommodating what we consider ourselves, whether that's service sector or radical vanguard. But we're always contingent on that flux, and being conscientious of it is so important. And then I wonder if you're actually delivering this lecture at the end of an era where those projects, the interventionist project, is just blankly impossible, given that those projects were situated on an address of class marginalization and access to capital, and our current social collective conditions are identity-based. So even the flux of capital can no longer be the critical aspect of the way we think about these projects, but it is ourselves as signifiers that trump, for lack of a better word, our capacity to critically address our positioning. And with identity, there's actually leading the charge in the interventionist project. There's very little we can do, because identity is not something that we can change. It's something that is biologically determined or evaluated for us. So I think we're in a new stage where the projects that you named are really the end of a moment.
I think they're definitely, I mean, it's been a very strange thing to observe. I think in the configuration in which they've been built up through all these exhibits, etc., in the way that they've been curated and the themes that have been created to categorize them, they've been defined in a way that's totally obsolete already. But what generated them in the first place, before they were recognized and identified and disseminated, this sort of rejection of for architects to work within a status quo and say, okay, I'm going to figure out like what my skill set is and how I can use it. I mean, it's the guise of assemble. I remember one of the women at a conference was on a panel, and she said, it was interesting because she said, she described the work in certain ways. And she said, well, like, there's no use for licensure anymore. So we're gonna keep doing the work, but I mean, we never intend to be licensed, because by virtue of doing this work, we're eradicating the need itself for licensure. This is something that soon can be said of a degree, of a university degree. So the same model, I think, is just beginning to pop up, where the refusal to accept the rules is going to keep. I mean, you saw that. I don't know if any of you have seen the documentary, The Ivory Tower, but it's about the neoliberalization of the university. And there's a whole chapter of that documentary on those who refuse to go to school and just use YouTube and whatever, which is super smart. But before long, they're going to be generating some sort of there's going to be ways to capitalize on their lack of investment. Like, it's just going to happen. But for now, there's a little margin of society that's trying to figure out how to function outside of the rules that they have identified as needing to be annihilated. Like, the cost of education is not if it's not something that can be sustained, then you can't count on the top to change it. Then it has to be from a moment of refusal. And maybe that's the only way, I don't know, but they're putting all the risk on themselves, and that's always that, it's the transfer of risk. the more people participate, the less risk there's going to be. I mean, right now, that's why, like, even doing interventionist practices, not only there's no risk, but it's going to get you to MoMA. Like, there's.
Yeah. But see, I think it's no longer going to get you to the MoMA.
Oh, for sure, that's over. And
I'm sorry to break it to all of you.
No, that's over. Like this, by the time you've reached the MoMA exhibit or the Venice Biennale, like that's it, it's over. Like they're already sniffing out the next thing. But it's interesting to see. That's why I keep looking at those documentary for contemporary art from Whitechapel. Like it's so fascinating to see what are the themes coming out, or the fade and themes for art. What are the themes coming out? What are the curators sniffing out? Because curators both pick on what's existing, but then produce it. By virtue of curating these things, they're producing ways of working. By the moment you begin to teach, I mean, for Anke, and I put myself in there just to show like I'm part of the problem. For Anke and I to have our students enter the actions call was like completely ridiculous, but absolutely not. Like of course it's what we wanted to do. It was super fun and the students loved it, but you know, anyways.
Ellen.
Hi. I was particularly curious about how we position ourselves, kind of grappling with this issue of institutional complicity and the desire for a cultural shift. How do we think about what we're bringing to the table when we have these conversations with our users? It seems like obviously more conversations with the client, and in some instances, the client is maybe not directly attached to the users. Hopefully, we'll also get to engage with the users themselves. But what should we be particularly conscious of when we're kind of taking a seat at that table and when we're engaging in that discourse with them?
You can get your teacher's answer to that. My answer is this. I'm always withholding judgment or thinking that I know, or that I know I'm seeing such a small sliver of the picture because there's so much that I don't see. The best I can do is to try to be as conscious as possible. Of what? I'm trying to be as conscious as possible of what do I want? Who am I working for? Why am I doing what I'm doing? In a true way, like really, what do I want? Am I drawing this because I enjoy drawing? Am I drawing it because I want my director to be happy with me, or I want a good faculty activities report, or I want a raise? Am I drawing it because I want to make sure that something I do gets published and I want longevity and to the point where like I had a whole phase, and it still happened, like I haven't updated our website in like 2 years. Like I refuse to, sometimes it's more than I can handle. I refuse to talk about what I do, like because I'm afraid if I do, it's going to affect how I feel about what I do. And so I'm the first gauge to be convinced of, like, it's hard enough for me to know why I do what I do. And I feel like my best bet is to keep it to myself, at least let it simmer, just so that I'm sure that it's meaningful to me, because I refuse to do something that's not meaningful to me. So given how hard it is for me, the next thing is to look at whoever's hiring you and to think, why do they do what they do? Like, what is the official intent? When is their intent to themselves? What is the real intent? I mean, I'm not saying we need to all be like, put ourselves through the psychotherapy or collective, but there's an aspect of that. To me, it's just a search for a certain degree of filtering through the unconscious that's so ambient. And I would say really just, even though I may sound super critical, I'm just kind of laying things out. I'm not judging. And I think that's important too.
Mireille, thank you so much for your generosity, for this, for sharing your intellect, but also for the transparency and forthright,
That's all I know how to do.
It's really great. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Have fun with the rest of the course. I'm going to show up to the other lectures now. I'll be like, sorry.
See you soon.
I hope I
Bye-bye.
didn't.
Thank you, Mireille.
Thank you.
Bye,
Anya,
everyone.
Jacob, thanks.
Thanks. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.